The air inside the Al-Safiya Mosque usually carried the low, rhythmic hum of recitation, a sound that had anchored the mornings of El Fasher for generations. On a Friday in September 2025, that hum was the only stability in a city unraveling at its seams. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, their foreheads pressing into the woven prayer mats, seeking a fleeting moment of communion in a province consumed by fire. Then the sky tore open. The drone strike did not just shatter the dome, it silenced the heartbeat of the entire district. When the dust finally settled over the rubble, the silence that followed was heavier than the screams. It was the silence of a void where a sanctuary used to be. 75 worshippers were gone, but the casualty count failed to capture the true magnitude of the loss. This was not merely a military tactical error or a tragic chaotic byproduct of urban warfare. It was a profound theological rupture, a deliberate piercing of the protective veil that has historically shrouded places of worship, even in the darkest times of conflict. In Islamic jurisprudence, as well as in the broader Semitic traditions that have shaped this region for millennia, the concept of haram is central. It designates a sacred zone, a sanctuary where violence is explicitly forbidden, where the blood of the hunted cannot be spilled, and where the frightened are guaranteed refuge. The Al-Safiya Mosque was one such vessel of immunity. For the families of North Darfur, its courtyard was the one place where the war was supposed to stop at the threshold. By targeting it during the Jum'ah prayers, the belligerents sent a terrifyingly clear message: there is no more haram. The axis of the community, the spiritual pivot point around which life revolved, was identified not as a protected zone, but as a target of opportunity. Satellite imagery from the days following the attack reveals a ghost town emerging in concentric circles around the cratered mosque. When the sanctuary falls, the neighborhood dies. We see a pattern here that transcends the immediate strategic value of a single building. It is an assault on the psychology of the faithful. To bomb a mosque in the middle of prayer is to tell the populace that their God cannot protect them, that the ancient compacts of civilized warfare have been dissolved, and that the only authority remaining is the one wielding the drone. Survivors speak of a disorientation that goes deeper than physical displacement. They describe a loss of direction, as if the compass of their daily lives had been smashed. The call to prayer, the adhan, which once organized the flow of time from dawn to dusk, was replaced by the erratic rhythm of artillery. This silencing of El Fasher's minarets forces us to confront a harrowing question about the nature of modern civil conflict. What happens to a community when its physical connection to the divine is severed? The destruction of Al-Safiya was not just an act of demolition, it was an act of erasure. It attempted to scrub the identity of the peace-seeking civilian from the map, leaving only the binary logic of the soldier. Yet, as we will see, the destruction of the stone temple often drives the spirit into hiding, forcing it to evolve, to mutate, and to survive in forms that no drone can lock onto. The silence of the mosque is deafening, but it is not the end of the prayer. It is simply the terrifying interval before the prayer changes its shape. As the dust of El Fasher settles into the history books of this long war, a more insidious pattern begins to emerge from the haze of the Gezira state. If the bombing of mosques represents the physical destruction of sanctuary, reports from Wad Madani in late 2024 and throughout 2025 revealed the psychological and spiritual dismantling of the believer. Here, in the breadbasket of Sudan, aid convoys were halted not just by roadblocks of burning tires, but by checkpoints of conscience. Desperate families fleeing the encroaching violence with nothing but the clothes on their backs found that the price of passage, or a bag of flour, was sometimes their soul. We have gathered harrowing accounts of forced conversions where access to humanitarian relief was allegedly made conditional on the recitation of the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith. This transaction, food for faith, is a grotesque perversion of the very religion the militias claim to defend. It stands in stark, blinding contrast to the historical tapestry of the region. Sudan has been a corridor of faiths for centuries, a place where Sufi mystics and Coptic monks often shared the same shade of the acacia tree. To understand the depth of this violation, we must look back to the foundational texts and traditions that these modern fighters ignore. The Covenant of Umar, a seminal document from the early Islamic conquests, explicitly guaranteed the safety of churches and the freedom of worship for Christians and newly acquired lands. Classical Islamic laws of war are rigorous in their protection of non-combatants, specifically forbidding the harming of monks, the destruction of temples, and the forced conversion of the conquered. Let there be no compulsion in religion, the Quran states, a verse that has stood as a bulwark against tyranny for 1,400 years. The events in Wad Madani represent a theological dissonance, a jarring break from this jurisprudence.
The militias operating these checkpoints have stripped the Shahada of its spiritual sanctity, turning a testimony of divine love into a bureaucratic password for survival. By weaponizing the creed, they do not spread faith, they hollow it out. They reduce the profound internal wrestling of the soul to a mere survival instinct. For the Christian minority in these areas, and for the Muslims who watch their religion being distorted into a tool of coercion, the trauma is twofold. There is the physical hunger, the gnawing emptiness of the stomach, and then there is the spiritual violation, the forcing of the tongue to speak words that the heart has not chosen in that moment. This is the weaponization of creed in its crudest form. It dissolves the social trust that allowed Sudan's diverse mosaic to exist. When a neighbor's faith becomes a liability, or when a specific prayer becomes a prerequisite for eating, the fabric of society unravels. The war has moved beyond the battlefield and into the conscience.
It is an attempt to rewrite the demographic and spiritual map of the country through coercion. However, history teaches us that coerced faith is fragile. The rituals performed at gunpoint rarely take root in the heart. Instead, they plant seeds of resentment and resistance that can outlast the conflict itself. As we analyze these violations, we see a tragic irony. In their zeal to impose a singular identity, these armed groups are destroying the very moral authority they claim to represent, leaving behind a legacy not of piety, but of profanity. The narrative now shifts away from the suffocating checkpoints and the cratered cities, drifting south towards the borderlands. Here, the landscape changes. The concrete gray of urban warfare gives way to the endless, dusty browns of the camps in South Sudan. By late 2025, over 12 million souls had been uprooted, a staggering biblical exodus flowing like a sorrowful river across the continent. In these sprawling, chaotic tent cities, stripped of their homes, their titles, and their temples, the people of Sudan are conducting an accidental, desperate experiment in theology. It is here, in what we might call the Cathedral of Canvas, that the true resilience of faith is being tested and proven. In the polarized neighborhoods of Khartoum or Omdurman, religious identity often dictated geography. Churches stood in certain quarters, mosques anchored others. The architecture of the city reinforced the distinctions between the communities. But in the refugee camps, the architecture of division has been obliterated. There are no walls here, only tarp and twine. The sheer density of human need has collapsed the physical distance between the Muslim and the Christian. We are witnessing a phenomenon that was rare in the days of peace, the sharing of sacred space. With resources scarce, a single tent might serve as a Quranic school in the morning and a space for Bible study in the afternoon. The call to prayer mingles with the sound of hymns, not in competition, but in a shared lamentation for the lost homeland. This is lived religion in its purest, most raw form. When the cathedrals are repurposed for war and the mosques are targeted by drones, the institution of religion crumbles. But the instinct of religion, the human need to connect with the divine and with one another, does not disappear. It migrates. It proves that the sanctity of the church was never really about the stained glass or the altar.
And the holiness of the mosque was never solely in the minaret. The sanctity resides in the assembly of the believers. In the absence of stone, the refugees have built a sanctuary out of solidarity. A Muslim family sharing their water ration with a Christian neighbor is enacting a liturgy more powerful than any sermon preached from a pulpit. This resurrection of the syncretic spirit of the Nile Valley is a paradox. It took the destruction of the physical religious infrastructure to reveal the deep interconnected roots of the culture. For centuries, the people of this region have lived in a liminal space where traditions bled into one another. The war tried to sever these ties, to force a binary choice, but the Cathedral of Canvas proves them wrong.
It suggests that faith, when stripped of its political weaponization and its grand edifices, returns to its fundamental purpose, a shelter for the weary. As we look at these fragile, wind-blown tents, we are seeing the future of Sudanese faith, a faith that is homeless, battered, and destitute, yet strangely, miraculously, more unified than it has been in decades. The buildings are gone, but the church and the mosque have never been more alive. They have simply moved into the hearts of the displaced, carried across the border in the chests of those who refused to let the war kill their God.